Good evening, fellow believers in Jesus Christ. Brother Tony is back on to read chapter 1 of Mountains of Spices by Hannah Hernard. May they administer unto you in the grace of Jesus Christ, our Messiah. In Jesus' mighty name, amen. Chapter 1, Mrs. Dismal Forbodings. It was a perfect spring morning down in the valley of humiliation, and everything seemed to be rejoicing in the warm sunshine and the soft, fragrant air. The pictures were robed in freshest green. The fruit trees were wearing festal apparel of white and pink blossoms. In the breeze, the wild flowers were dancing gaily, while the asphodels, with the sun shining through their transparent white blossoms, white blooms, stood rank on the steep of slopes above the blue lake, like any army of wax torches. In the pastures through which the river wound, the lambs frisked about their mothers, and the kids played catch me if you can among the rocks. Catch me if you can. I know that. That's the title of a movie that starred Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks. Birds of every size and description worked ardently at the business of nest building, and the air echoed with the sound of innumerable notes and calls and trills, while bees and crickets kept up a constant undertone of humming. Altogether, it was a perfect day down there in the valley, with everything that had breath and moved out in the open to welcome spring. In the shadow of some old, dark, twisted trees, however, standing back from the main road, which ran through the village of much trembling, was a garden overgrown with weeds and sickly looking cabbage plants. Mopping in the middle of the garden was a most dilapidated cottage. The windows and doors of each were all tightly shut. Up from the chimney of this cottage rose a thin, furtive looking spiral of smoke, which crept up into the air as unostentatious unostentatious unostent stented that sounds like a tough word. Unostentate unostentatiously as possible, as though ashamed to show itself on such a perfect day as this. Inside the cottage, cowering over the smoky little fire, sat Mrs. Dismal Forebodings, wearing a dreary-hued dress and wrapped in a drearier gray shawl, while her face wore an expression of deepest misery and gloom. There came a brisk rap on the door, and almost before Mrs. Dismal's hesitating "come in" could be heard, in marched her neighbor Mrs. Valiant. The contrast between the two women was as great as possible, and everyone, in much trembling, wondered at the friendship, if such a one-sided affair could be so named. which existed between them, but it dated back to their school days, and Mrs. Valiant seemed to have a queer notion, as the neighbors called it, of not allowing the friendship to drop. Mrs. Valiant marched into the room, stopped short, and uttered what sounded exactly like a little snort. Good gracious, Dismal, she exclaimed. What are you doing in here with all the windows shut on such a perfect day as this? That horrid little smoky stove is enough to suffocate you. Please shut the door behind you at once, Valiant, said Mrs. Dismal fretfully. The draft is simply cruel, and this dreadful east wind always increases my rheumatism unendurably. East wind, said Mrs. Valiant, with another snort. My dear Dismal, the air is as balmy as on a midsummer day, and what little breeze there come is coming directly from the south. My weathercock never lies, replied Mrs. Dismal firmly, and when I looked at it this morning, the wind was in the east. Besides, I feel it all over me in every bone and joint of my body, and do not need even the confirmation of the weathercock. At least, urged Mrs. Valiant, let me open the south window, and do, my dear Dismal, allow yourself to be persuaded to lay aside that dreadful shawl and to put on something cooler and prettier, and come out with me for a little while, for, added she in a mysterious tone, the most delightful and unexpected thing has happened, and I have come along on purpose to take you to my cottage so that you can share in the pleasure. Mrs. Dismal, however, refused to be either curious or interested. Instead, she poked the fire, causing a thick spiral of choking smoke to billow out into the room, and said with a shiver, please leave that window alone, Valiant. Even if it were the warmest of days, I would not venture out of the cottage today, for my almanac tells me that it is a black day, a day of gloom and darkness and danger, and harm would most certainly befall me if I ventured outside. I have great faith in my almanac and never disregard its warnings. Uh, that's what God said the day of the Lord would be, that being the time of Jacob's trouble. It will be just like that. Uh, of course, those words kind of describe what I saw in that dream that I dreamed a number of years ago in the year 2019. All I could remember was I was sitting next to a teacher that I knew years before in a school I went to here in my hometown. Oh, and in the dream, and then all of a sudden something happened to where it just became utter chaos in the dream. Ugh. What almanac is that? Cried Mrs. Valiant, walking up to the wall on which was pinned a large and hideous monstrosity. Why, Dismal, don't tell me you've gone in for astrology. This is printed by a well-known firm of swindling frauds who live by exploiting the fears of other people. It's pure nonsense. Mrs. Dismal looked much affronted and answered tartly, I have never known my valuable almanac to be mistaken when it says that woe and calamity are approaching. Woe and calamity of some sort always do follow, and I shall not be foolish enough to disregard its warnings today, but shall remain indoors. Yeah, that's what the that's what the unbelievers in pagan secular Nineveh did when God had sent the Hebrew prophet named Jonah uh, to warn them of what was going to happen after their own wickedness and sinfulness had reached unto God in his kingdom. Ugh, man, they made the right decision when they chose to heed the warning that God was speaking to them through that Hebrew prophet. Ugh. I wish you would let me tear the horrid thing off the wall and throw it on the fire, exclaimed Mrs. Valiant in exasperation, and let me put up one of the red letter calendars which I use myself. For today mine says, This is the day which the Lord hath made. We will be glad and rejoice in it. Well, that deserves an amen. That's a song in the Christian hymns. Nothing will induce me to discard my valuable almanac, said poor Mrs. Dismal. Neither shall I venture to set foot outside the cottage today, as sure as my name is Dismal Forbodings. Calamity is near. Calamity. That's written in the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy. If I had a name like that, cried Mrs. Valiant, suddenly losing all patience, I would certainly get rid of it and change to a better. Mrs. Dismal was deeply offended, but whenever her warm-hearted, if rather quick-tempered neighbor became impatient, she always reacted with martyr-like resignation. So now she said in a tone of patient reproach, It is a very ancient and honorable name, Valiant. It has been credibly demonstrated to date back to before the flood. There have been dismal forebodings for longer than can be reckoned. Mrs. Valiant laughed heartily at her friend's absurdity, though this one though this was one of the times when she felt she would dearly like to shake a little sense into the poor silly creature before her, but she had an inner reason, known only to herself and the chief shepherd, for bearing long with her unhappy neighbor, but learning to accept her lovingly, just as she was. So now she answered cheerfully but tactlessly, Well, the antediluvian dismal forebodings must have become extinct anyhow, for there were none of them in the ark. I wonder who was foolish enough to found the family name again. Mrs. Dismal was now too offended to reply. She drew her shawl closer around her shoulders, shivered, and appeared to be unconscious that there was anyone beside herself in the cottage. Mrs. Valiant's conscience smote her. It was really dreadful. Oh, the way she let her tongue run away with her when she had come on purpose to try to help her friend. She hurried to apologize, saying penitently, "Forgive me, Dismal dear. I know I ought not to have said that. But oh, how I wish you would let me help you out of this unhappy condition into which you have fallen, and persuade you to put off the spirit of dreariness and to put on the garment of praise." Mrs. Dismal burst into tears. "How can you talk like that, Valiant? You are absolutely heartless. I am sure I was always cheerful and contented enough before, but now that all this cruel trouble has come upon me, what can you expect? A desolate widow woman all these years, working myself to death to provide for my three unfortunate children. This was a bit of invention, Mrs. Dismal's husband having left her a small but adequate annuity, and to bring them up respectably and prepare them for happier homes of their own than ever fell to my lot. And now what has happened? You know, Valiant, you know perfectly well. Yet you are heartless enough to stand there rebuking me for being miserable. My daughter gloomy, deserted by her graceless husband, her position lost, put to shame before all her relatives, and obliged to come creeping home to her widowed mother, she the daughter-in-law of Lord Fearing himself, with no one prepared to lift a finger ah, to help her get her rights, and then poor spiteful to find herself married to a drunkard who beats and abuses her shamefully, forced to live in a miserable little attic, a poor and despised relative in the house of her cousins. And Craven, here she sobbed convulsively, my darling Craven, my only son, wrongfully condemned on a trumped up charge of assault and disorderly behavior, actually put in prison. Actually put in prison. That's what they did to the that's what happened to the apostles of Jesus Christ when they went through with getting the gospel preached to the world back in the time of the first century. And those words, married to a drunkard who beats and abuses her shamefully, that's something I remembered reading about the actress who voiced the character named Ducky in the cartoon film called The Land Before Time, how she was treated abusively by her own father before she and her own mother were murdered back in the year 1988. And you Valiant, who did at least once have a strong husband to support you and still have children who apparently never caused you the least sorrow. There you stand upbraiding me and actually suggesting that I ought to put on the garment of praise. Whatever sort of fantastic apparel that may be, it would obviously be utterly indecent clothing for a broken-hearted widow whose children are enduring a martyrdom of injustice and suffering. You know, it's no wonder. It's no wonder why Martin Luther let it be written in his letter to Philip Melanchthon in 1521 when he said that this life is not a place where justice resides. And it is true indeed. This life is not a place where justice resides at all. Mrs. Valiant went up to the weeping woman and put her arms comfortingly around the shaking shoulders, saying very gently, "You misunderstand me, Dismal. I do know all about your sorrows and troubles, and it would make me so happy to be able to comfort you a little bit and to help you find strength and courage to meet them and grace to transform them into something lovely. That is really why I'm here this morning. Let me tell you the happy news, dear Dismal, and persuade you to go with me to my cottage. For do you know what has happened? No, I am sure you will never be able to guess. Something to gladden even your sad heart. She paused, hopefully looking for a gleam of interest or curiosity in the miserable face before her. But Mrs. Dismal Forebodings continued to sob and to rock herself backwards and forwards, utterly indifferent to anything else in the whole wide world except her own misfortunes. So, after waiting a moment, Mrs. Valiant went on in a voice full of cheerfulness and pleasure. Well, you will never guess, so I will tell you. You remember that when your crippled niece, much afraid, left the valley, people said that the shepherd had taken her to the high places. Well, it was true, perfectly true. And do you know what has happened, Dismal? She has just returned to the valley on a visit, and she isn't a cripple any longer. Her lame feet are completely healed, and so is her twisted mouth. She is so strong and straight. You would hardly know her. Besides that, she has got a new name. She is much afraid no longer, but is Grace and Glory. Just fancy that. What a beautiful name to receive. She has also brought her two friends with her, lovely women named Peace and Joy. And they tell us that Grace and Glory lives now in the kingdom of love. The kingdom of love. That right there is the kingdom of God, heaven itself. Ugh. And is actually a member of the royal household, and everywhere the king goes, she goes too. Just imagine it, Dismal. It's like the most wonderful fairy tale that you ever heard, only far lovelier, because it's absolutely true, and it has all happened because she went with the shepherd to the high places. If Mrs. Valiant had wanted to gain the attention of her miserable friend, she had certainly succeeded. Mrs. Dismal Forebodings sat staring at her in what appeared to be stunned silence, apparently unable to say a word, so Mrs. Valiant went on happily. Yeah, you look at those words from those fairy tale stories that were written years ago in the past, and they all lived happily ever after. That's what it'll be for us who have become believers by the new birth. after the last judgment against temptation and sin happens in the future. Then when this old world passes away, hey, and after that happens, new heavens and a new earth will come. And there will be no more sin, no more sorrow, no more crying. There will be no more pain as well. Now here she is back in the valley, as I said before, and with her two friends. They are over in the cottage with my daughter Mercy, and we are arranging a little party of welcome. Just a few of her old friends and neighbors, and you, her aunt, really must be there too. Come, dear Dismal, just for a little while. Dry your tears, for you cannot in any way help your dear ones by sitting here weeping your eyes out in this dreary room. Put on your best dress and come with me and have a share in the rejoicing over the good things, the wonderful things which have befallen poor miserable little much afraid. Mrs. Dismal Forebodings said not a word, for in truth she was almost stunned by the news, the dreadful news. Nothing, she felt, could be more untimely, more horrible, more humiliating than the return of the wretched cripple they had all despised, and whose departure they had tried to thwart. Here she was, it seemed, healed, surrounded with friends, advanced to glory and honor, a member of the king's household, now returning almost as a queen to the valley where she had been a miserable, despised nobody. Moreover, returning just in time to find her closest relatives in the most humiliating circumstance possible, her cousin Gloomy, who had married so well, now deserted by her husband, a destitute beggar in her mother's cottage, spiteful, married to a drunkard who had nearly killed her, living a life of penurious misery in a tiny attic, and worst of all, her cousin Craven Fear, whom she had so insultingly refused to marry, now actually in prison. Could the return have been more untimely? Could indeed anything which she, Dismal Forebodings, might have imagined be a greater calamity? How true my almanac is, said Mrs. Dismal to herself, with a sinking of heart which even she had seldom before experienced. A day of calamity indeed, no severer blow, no severer blow could have befallen me. She said not a word, however. With an immense effort, she bit back the bitter lamentations which almost escaped her lips, for she suddenly remembered that an aunt would scarcely be expected to bewail the fact that a crippled niece had now returned to her old home completely cured and holding a position in the king's household. If it had been any of our own relatives telling me the news, thought Mrs. Dismal bitterly, they would have understood my feelings perfectly, and we could have lamented together. But Mrs. Valiant is quite different. Certainly, she would never understand, so she sat in frozen silence. Come, Dismal, said Mrs. Valiant persuasively, after waiting in vain for some expression of pleasure or interest from her neighbor. Do come along with me to the cottage and see for yourself the delightful truth of what I have told you. Come and welcome grace and glory and enjoy the happy fellowship with other friends in my house, and forget for a little while your own grief in rejoicing with another. At that, Mrs. Dismal at last found words. Thank you, Valiant, said she, but nothing will persuade me to leave the cottage today, or to do anything so heartless as to seek personal enjoyment at a party while my daughters eat the bread of affliction and my son languishes in prison. As for much afraid, she continued, unable to conceal her bitterness any longer. She certainly was not going to call that girl by any new name the king might have chosen to bestow upon her. As for much afraid, a more undutiful and ungrateful niece cannot exist anywhere. If she chooses to return now to gloat over the misfortunes which have overtaken her relatives, it is only another example of her callous nature, and I, for one, shall certainly not present her with an opportunity to do so. Pray return at once to your party, Valiant, and leave me to the solace of solitude in my misery. Mrs. Valiant regretfully realized that she could do no good by staying longer, that any further importunity would only increase her neighbor's resistance and resentment. So she sorrowfully took her departure, having failed in a mission which, in truth, she had feared would prove unsuccessful. Left alone in the cottage, Mrs. Dismal forebodings brooded on the disastrous news, and the more she brooded, the worse it seemed. What a cruel blow dealt by fate to permit that girl to return just now, who, if she had married Craven, as she ought to have done, would now be a disgraced and would now be as disgraced and humiliated and wretched as her mother-in-law, and a convenient scapegoat on whom the family could have heaped their reproaches. But now, instead of that, here she was gloriously free, richly provided for, and what an honorable new name! It's scandalous, sobbed Mrs. Dismal. The injustice of life, the hammer blows of fate, a calamity of calamities. She sat there brooding bitterly for perhaps half an hour when she heard a light tap on the door of the cottage, and with a sickening sense of foreboding, she called it out sourly. Who is there? It is I, your niece, dear Aunt May. I come in. And with that, the door opened, and Grace and Glory stepped into the cheerless room. In spite of herself, Mrs. Dismal Forebodings looked with eager curiosity at the girl who had once been much afraid. She saw it was quite true what Mrs. Valiant had told her. There was a great difference in her. She was so straight and walked with such ease and poise that it gave one the impression that she was much taller than before, and now that the unsightly deformed mouth was healed, and she could look unshrinkingly and without self consciousness into the face of others, she was very unlike the ugly creature of former days. Yet, in another way, thought Mrs. Dismal, forebodings, She is not at all out of the ordinary. Among a crowd, there would be nothing to single her out, except perhaps the expression of quiet, steady happiness on her face and the light in her eyes. Grace and Glory hesitated a moment at the door, and then, as her aunt offered not a single word of greeting, she walked quietly toward the gray bent figure crouched in the rocking chair beside the stove and stooping down, gently kissed her aunt's cheek. Mrs. Dismal Forebodings recoiled almost as though a reptile had approached her and putting out her hands pushed her niece away. There is no need for insincere tokens of affection. Much afraid, she said coldly, I can dispense with a kiss from you. Her niece looked at her compassionately, but only said gently, I can understand just how you feel, dear aunt. I know that I was always sadly lacking in love and in attention to your wishes, but I hear that you have experienced much sorrow since last we saw one another, and my heart aches for you. I long to be able to help in some way, or at least to share your sorrow. She paused a moment and then added shyly, I have been changed, you know, since I went away, and have learned to love. I have a new name now, and I hope a new nature. New nature. Therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. So I heard from Mrs. Valiant, said her aunt icily, but I shall certainly not call you by anything but your real name. It will take more than just a new name, I can assure you, to make me forget what you were before. To me, you will always be much afraid. Well, I can understand that too, said Grace and Glory, and you may call me by the old name if you so please. But she added smilingly, Grace is a shorter and easier name to say, and it exactly describes the means by which all the happiness and peace and healing have come to me. Dear Aunt Dismal, if only I could persuade you in your sorrow and grief and pain to turn to the one who so graciously and wonderfully helped me. A flush of angry color appeared in her aunt's cheeks. Do I understand you to refer to? She stumbled over the hated name, to the shepherd, much afraid. Yes, answered her niece earnestly. I beg, no. Rather, I command that you will not ever mention that name to me again, said Mrs. Dismal Forebodings, in a voice shaking with angry excitement. You know well enough what all of us thought about your disgraceful behavior, forsaking all your relatives in the most heartless manner. But do you know what happened afterwards? Do you know that it was that shepherd of yours who trumped up the false charge against my unhappy son, Craven, which resulted in his being put in prison? My son, my only son, treated as a common felon and sentenced to a 6 months term of imprisonment. Oh, that sounds like a false accusation right there. Grace and Glory, who had come to the cottage with her heart overflowing with love and compassionate longing to help her aunt escape from the misery which she herself had known, could think of nothing to say. She had her own personal memories of Craven Fear's bullyings and could well understand how much some hapless victim might have rejoiced to be delivered by the shepherd out of his clutches. Also, that a term in prison might well prove to be a sal- a salutary, though bitter, lesson to him, but she did not feel that it was the moment to suggest all this to his mother, so she really did not know what to say. It was the dreadful contrast to everything which she had hoped and expected, thought Grace and Glory to herself, which made it so unspeakably difficult up there on the high places in the kingdom of love, where every thought was love and her companion's joy and peace were never absent. How different things had looked. She remembered how, but a short time before, she had been sitting beside the king in the royal gardens, and they had looked down into this valley, and her heart had ached and throbbed with compassion and with the longing to be able to help her relatives. Nothing had seemed too difficult for love to undertake if only they could be rescued and delivered from the tormenting things by which they were enslaved. While they promise them liberty, they themselves are the servants of corruption, for of whom a man is overcome, of the same is he brought in bondage. But now down here, face to face with reality, how different, how almost impossibly different it seemed. Here was her aunt, absolutely shut up within her own miserable self. She could think of nothing else, be interested in nothing else, for all her thoughts were chained to the one wretched center. She was as outside the realm of love as though she lived in a world of outer darkness where love simply did not exist. That's what hell is like in real life. How, oh, how, thought Grace and Glory desperately, could one get into her dungeon, and how could one strike off the chains which the prisoner seemed actually to cherish and to be unwilling to be rescued from? How could one even speak to her of the only deliverer when she believed that he was the cause of all her unhappiness? Yes, indeed, it was one thing up there in the glory and light of the kingdom of love to feel a passionate longing to help and save, but when one got rid down, but when one got right down into the midst of the actual reality, how was it to be done? How could one reach hearts immured in impregnable prisons, and how awaken even the beginning of a desire for deliverance and pain to be delivered? Grace and Glory remembered the whole conversation up there on the high places, and how they had all agreed that this was the very likeliest time of all for them to be able to help Mrs. Dismal Forbodings and her family, because the calamities which had overtaken them would surely make them begin to feel their need of the shepherd's help. But now it was all so different. She remembered the voice of the king saying, I need someone to speak for me, for they will not come to me themselves. And her glad, exultant cry that she would be his mouthpiece. She remembered the tone in which he had said, Do you think they will listen to you, Grace and Glory? What had she answered? You shall tell me what to say, and I will say it for you. Yes, thought Grace and Glory. Suddenly, that is the answer. He must tell me what to say. He must teach me. I can do nothing now, but I will go to him and will tell him all about it. And I will ask him to teach me what approach I am to make and how to win right through into my aunt's prison house. However, she made one last attempt to break down the antagonism against herself. Dearest aunt, she said, I do hope you will sometimes let me come to see you to do what I can to help. And perhaps next time you will let me tell you how I was delivered from all my fears and sorrows. Thank you, much afraid, said her aunt icily, but I am not interested. I know already just what you will say, and it is the last thing that I am interested to hear. Grace and Glory, feeling exactly as though she were holding a tiny pebble in her hand with which to try to batter down an impregnable stronghold, rose to her feet and prepared to take her departure. She put her arms around her aunt and kissed the coldly unresponsive cheek, saying softly, only let me love you, Aunt Dismal. Let me try to atone in some way for all my lovelessness in the past. Do let me come to you and my cousin Gloomy and help in any way that I can. But the only answer she received was, you have chosen and gone your own way, much afraid, and it is not my way. And I do not hesitate to tell you that even though misfortune has overtaken me while good fortune has smiled upon you, I do not at all desire to be pitied and patronized by you. Smitten I may be and left desolate and friendless, but patronized I will not be. You need not trouble yourself to visit here again. Grace and Glory left the cottage and walked sadly away, wondering if anything could have been more unlike her radiant, loving dreams of helping her relatives than the actual reality. For a few moments, she felt almost overwhelmed when, however, she reached the cottage where she and Mercy had lived together and found her friend and Mrs. Valiant bustling around full of cheerful preparations for the party to which the chief shepherd himself had been invited. And when she saw Joy and Peace, whom she had left at the cottage, telling herself that if she were accompanied by her two handmaidens when she visited her miserable aunt, that she might appear to be showing off when she met their loving greeting. She did feel a balm applied to her heart, and she said to herself, next time I go to visit Aunt Dismal, I shall take Joy and Peace with me. There was just time before the guests arrived for bustling Mrs. Valiant to take her aside for a moment and whisper, well, my dear, how did you get on, and what sort of reception did you receive from that poor creature Dismal? She told me never to visit her again, answered Grace and Glory sorrowfully, and I am afraid she really meant it. You would never believe how many times she has said exactly the same thing to me, replied Mrs. Valiant cheerily, but she would be quick enough to object if I took her at her word. Never pay any attention to anything poor Dismal says. My dear, she is starved for love and doesn't know it. Just go on loving. It always wins in the end. Without natural affection. Mrs. Valiant, as you may easily guess without being told, was another who had been with the shepherd to the high places and wore in her heart the flowering plant of love, which made her a citizen of that kingdom. Then they heard the sound of footsteps outside and of happy, laughing voices, and the next moment the chief shepherd himself, surrounded by his friends, entered the cottage, and the feast began. The kettle sang on the hearth. The guests talked and laughed merrily. Together, the yellow cat lay purring on the chief shepherd's knees, and the black and white one curled up on the lap of grace and glory. The sheep dogs lay at the door, wagging their tails, and Mrs. Valiant busied herself filling and refilling the cups with tea, and all in the cottage was the most mirthful and contented spot in the whole village, just as though a little bit of the kingdom of love had been transplanted down to the valley, which of course was the case. If only poor Dismal were here, sighed Mrs. Valiant, just once, and then she looked across at the shepherd and saw that his eyes were looking straight at her as though he read and understood her thoughts. Then Mrs. Valiant gave a little contented smile and said to herself, "It will be all right. He wants it even more than we do. It will take more than poor Dismal and her unhappy family to evade his love in the end." Then she went on bustling about, filling cups and attending to the wants of everyone, and was without in the least realizing it, next to the chief shepherd himself, the most cheering and heartwarming person in the room. You know, it really goes to show why this world needs Jesus Christ, knowing after everything that has happened since the fall of man had happened. Well, fellow believers, that was great getting to read this chapter in Mountains of Spices to you guys. May it bless and administer unto all of you, and may God use it to get the gospel of the truth that is Jesus Christ preached to the world. In Jesus' mighty name, amen.